moon hung low and bloated in the sky, casting pale light over the quiet suburb. Fallen leaves crunched underfoot, and the wind carried the sharp tang of approaching winter as Logan adjusted his night's costume. His cardboard sword clanked awkwardly against his side. Halloween was his favorite night of the year, and he wasn't about to let some chilly wind ruin it. Beside him, Mia pulled her witch hat lower over her ears. Her green face paint had already begun to smear around the edges, but she was too busy scanning the row of houses to care. "We're too far," Mia muttered, glancing over her shoulder. The neighborhood behind them had grown eerily still, as if they'd left the rest of the world behind. No more kids in costumes, no porch lights, just a stretch of cracked sidewalk leading deeper into darkness. "It's fine," Logan said, forcing a smile. "One more house and then we turn back, okay? We're gonna find the jackpot." He held up his nearly full pillowcase with pride, but even he couldn't deny that something felt off. Most houses in this part of town were completely dark, their windows blank and unwelcoming. A few had hollow-eyed jack-o'-lanterns, their candles sputtering weakly. Then they saw it. At the end of a long driveway, half hidden behind clawing tree branches, loomed a Victorian house that looked out of place even on Halloween. Its roof sagged and shingles dangled like broken teeth. The porch was wide, the wood splintering in places, and a single orange light burned from within, flickering in a way that set Logan's nerves on edge. "That's it," he said, his voice wavering. "Bet they have full-size candy bars." Mia swallowed hard. "I don't know, Logan. It looks wrong." "It's just an old house," he said, more for his own benefit than hers. "Come on." Together, they approached, leaves rustling beneath them. The driveway stretched on forever, or so it seemed, and the wind howled louder the closer they got. Mia's hand found his. She didn't say anything, but her grip was tight. The porch steps groaned under their weight. Logan felt as if 1,000 unseen eyes were watching, the darkness pressing in from every direction. He hesitated, his hand poised to knock on the door, when it suddenly creaked open of its own accord. An old man stood in the doorway, tall and thin as a skeleton. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his bones, as if it might tear if he moved too suddenly. He wore a tattered grey suit that seemed more like a relic than clothing, and his smile was too wide, too fixed. His eyes, grey and clouded, focused intently on them. "Trick or treat," Logan managed, his voice cracking. The old man's smile stretched further, his lips peeling back. "Ah, how delightful. I wasn't sure anyone would come." He stepped aside, gesturing into the house. "I have something special inside for visitors brave enough to make it this far." Logan glanced at Mia, whose face was pale under the smudged paint. He wanted to walk away, to claim they were just joking, but the old man's eyes seemed to pin them in place. Reluctantly, Logan crossed the threshold. Mia followed, her hand trembling in his. The door closed with a heavy, final thud that echoed through the dim hallway. The air inside was thick, carrying the scent of decay and something metallic. Candles flickered in tarnished holders, casting long shadows that danced like twisted limbs. Heavy drapes covered every window, blocking out the moonlight and any hope of seeing beyond. The old man moved with a shuffling step. "This way," he said, his voice rough, as though it hadn't been used in years. He led them through a narrow hall, lined with faded portraits of somber-faced people whose eyes seemed to follow them. Logan couldn't shake the feeling that they were being judged or worse, measured. At the end of the hall was a parlor, its walls lined with dusty bookshelves. In the center of the room, a small wooden table held a silver tray. On the tray sat 2 candies, wrapped in shiny red foil. They glowed faintly, reflecting the candlelight in a way that made them look almost alive. "For you," the old man said, gesturing toward the candies. "A treat, just for you." Mia shook her head, stepping back until she nearly stumbled over a warped floorboard. "We're good. We should probably—" "Nonsense," the old man interrupted, his tone icy. "You've come all this way. It would be terribly rude to refuse." Logan stared at the candies, unease coiling in his stomach. Something about this was all wrong. "What's in them?" he asked, his voice shaking despite himself. The old man's smile never faltered. "Oh, nothing you haven't tasted before. It's the experience that makes it special." Mia pulled at Logan's arm. "Let's go. Now." But the old man moved with surprising speed, his skeletal hand latching onto Logan's wrist. His grip was cold and impossibly strong. "You can't leave empty-handed," he hissed, the smile dropping away. "It's tradition." The room seemed to darken, the shadows pressing closer. Logan's breath caught in his throat as he struggled to pull away. The old man's eyes bored into his, and for a moment, everything went still. Then Logan yanked his arm free, grabbing one of the candies in the process. "Fine," he snapped, desperate to break the tension. "We'll take it." The old man relaxed instantly, the smile returning. He released Logan's wrist and stepped back, folding his hands neatly in front of him. "Go on," he said. "Taste." Logan unwrapped the candy, the foil crackling in the silence. Mia's eyes pleaded with him not to, but he was trapped. He placed it in his mouth, the sweetness turning bitter almost instantly. It burned his tongue, a sickly metallic taste spreading like poison. He tried to spit it out, but his jaw locked. The room tilted, colors swimming before his eyes. He could hear Mia screaming, but it was distant, as if underwater. When it was over, Logan stumbled back, gasping for air. The old man watched with a satisfied expression. "There now," he said. "That wasn't so bad, was it?" But Logan knew something was wrong. The world felt different, sharper, colder. Mia's grip was still on his arm, but her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. "Logan," she whispered. "Are you okay?" He opened his mouth to reassure her, but the words wouldn't come. His chest felt heavy, his heartbeat erratic. He turned back to the old man, who was now watching with rapt attention. "What did you do to me?" Logan croaked, his voice hoarse. "Simply fulfilled the promise of the evening," the old man replied, his tone mocking. "Every treat has a cost." Before either of them could react, the floor beneath their feet groaned. It felt like something was moving below the surface, shifting and writhing. Logan stumbled, grabbing Mia as they backed away from the table. The shadows along the walls began to move, no longer confined to flickering candlelight. They stretched and twisted, taking shapes that shouldn't have been possible. "We're leaving," Mia said, her voice trembling but determined. She pulled Logan toward the hallway, but the old man's laughter stopped them in their tracks. It was deep and echoing, filling the room like a living thing. "Leave." "Oh, my dear," he said, his smile spreading grotesquely. "No one leaves until the game is done." The walls seemed to close in, the portrait's eyes burning with malevolent glee. The air grew stifling, and the shadows advanced, inching closer with each flicker of the candles. Logan felt cold sweat drip down his neck. He glanced at Mia, who was breathing hard, her gaze darting wildly for any exit. "Run," Logan whispered, though he wasn't sure his legs would carry him. "Run," Logan whispered again, his voice trembling. This time, Mia didn't hesitate. She grabbed his hand, and together they bolted toward the hallway. The air around them seemed to thicken, slowing their movements, as if the shadows themselves were trying to hold them back. Behind them, the old man's laughter continued to echo, a deep, bone-chilling sound that made the walls vibrate. They stumbled through the dim hall, their breaths ragged. The portraits lining the walls were no longer still, their eyes followed with a malevolent intensity, some mouths even twitching into cruel sneers. Logan's heartbeat pounded in his ears as they reached the front door. He lunged for the handle, twisting and pulling, but it refused to budge. It felt like the house itself was fighting to keep them trapped. "Logan, hurry," Mia cried, panic edging her voice. She yanked at the door, her knuckles turning white. The wood was cold, almost pulsing beneath her touch. Behind them, the shadows crept closer, black tendrils inching along the floor like living vines. Logan turned, his stomach lurching as he saw them. Shapes were forming within the darkness, half-visible faces with sunken eyes and gaping mouths, whispering incomprehensible words that made his skin crawl. "It won't open," Logan shouted, his voice raw with frustration and fear. He slammed his shoulder against the door, but it felt like striking solid stone. Mia turned, pressing her back to the door, her eyes wide with terror. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice cracking. The old man appeared at the end of the hallway, his form seemingly gliding rather than walking. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if savoring every moment of their fear. "There is no escape," he said, his voice low and resonant. "You accepted the treat. Now you must play." "What do you want?" Logan demanded, his fists clenched. He wanted to sound brave, but his voice betrayed him, trembling with fear. The old man tilted his head, his smile widening until it looked like it might tear his face apart. "I want only to test your courage," he said. "A game to determine if you are truly brave, or if you will become part of the house like so many before you." The shadows around them rippled, forming shapes, twisted limbs, gnarled hands reaching out hungrily. Mia grabbed Logan's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "This can't be real," she whispered, tears brimming in her eyes. But the cold touch of the shadows left no room for doubt. "Play my game, and you may leave," the old man continued, his voice as smooth as silk. "Refuse, and you will become one with the darkness." Logan met Mia's gaze, fear mirrored in her eyes. They didn't have a choice. "What's the game?" he asked, his throat dry. The old man's smile faded, replaced by an expression of utter stillness. "Hide and seek," he said. "You have until the last candle burns out." The words sent a chill down Logan's spine. Every flickering candle in the house seemed to flare brighter for an instant, as if marking the beginning of something terrible. Then, one by one, they began to sputter, their flames dimming. "Run," the old man said softly, almost kindly. "The clock is ticking." Without waiting another second, Logan and Mia turned and ran deeper into the house. There was no logic to their movements, just blind terror propelling them forward. They passed through rooms that seemed to twist and change, hallways that stretched and narrowed. The house was alive, its layout shifting like a living maze designed to keep them lost. Doors led to nowhere or back to places they had already been. The walls groaned and whispered, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. Logan Mia grabbed his arm, pulling him into a small room lined with shelves. Dust and cobwebs hung thick in the air. They ducked behind a tattered curtain, their breaths ragged and loud. Logan could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The room was deathly quiet, but he could feel the presence of something moving beyond the door, a heavy, oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. "We have to get out of here," Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. Logan nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. He didn't know how much time had passed or how long the candles would last. All he knew was that they couldn't stop moving. Suddenly the door creaked open, slow and deliberate. Logan held his breath, every muscle tensed. The old man's footsteps were unnaturally loud, echoing through the room. Logan pressed himself harder against the wall, willing himself to be invisible. He could see the old man's shadow stretching across the floor, impossibly long and thin. It paused just inches from the curtain. "Children," the old man crooned, his voice filled with a mocking sweetness. "Where are you hiding?" Logan's chest ached from holding his breath. He could feel Mia trembling beside him. The silence stretched on, the tension suffocating. Then, with a suddenness that made them both jump, the old man laughed, a cruel, hollow sound that seemed to reverberate through the walls. His footsteps retreated, and the door creaked shut behind him. Logan exhaled shakily, his body sagging with relief. "We need to find a way out," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mia nodded, her eyes wide with fear. They crept out from behind the curtain, every creak of the floorboards making them wince. The air felt colder now, and the shadows seemed to cling to them, as if reluctant to let them go. They moved quickly but cautiously, searching for any sign of an exit. Every room they entered seemed to lead deeper into the house's twisted maze, and every hallway felt darker and more oppressive. Eventually, they found themselves in a room that looked different from the others. It was small and circular, with a single candle burning in the center. The flame was weak, flickering as if it might go out at any moment. Logan and Mia approached cautiously, drawn by a faint warmth that felt out of place in the house's chilling darkness. As they neared the candle, they saw something carved into the floor, around it a series of symbols and runes that glowed faintly. "What is this?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," Logan admitted. "But it might be important." He knelt down, examining the symbols. They seemed familiar, though he couldn't say why. As he traced one with his finger, a sudden jolt of pain shot through his hand, and he pulled back with a gasp. The candle's flame flared, casting harsh shadows across the room. The symbols glowed brighter, and the air crackled with energy. Logan and Mia exchanged a glance, fear etched into their faces. From somewhere deep within the house, the old man's laughter rang out once more, louder and more menacing than before. The game was far from over, and it was clear that whatever lay ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. The candle's sudden flare sent shadows darting across the walls like twisted specters, and Logan and Mia both took a shaky step back. The air was thick with a low hum, almost like a vibration, coming from the runes carved into the floor. Whatever they had stumbled upon was not just an ordinary room. It felt like the heart of the house, the source of its dark power. "Logan, what did you do?" Mia asked, her voice strained. She looked around nervously, half expecting the old man to materialize from the darkness. "I don't know," Logan said, rubbing his hand where the jolt of pain had struck him. The symbols on the floor glowed brighter, casting an eerie red light. "But I think it did something." Before they could move, the door they had entered through slammed shut with a deafening bang. The walls quivered, and a cold wind whipped around them, extinguishing the candle in a single violent gust. The room plunged into total darkness. Mia grabbed Logan's hand, her grip clammy and tight. "We have to get out of here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of their hearts. The darkness pressed in, thick and suffocating. A scratching sound echoed from somewhere above, like claws raking across wood. Logan strained to see, but the pitch black swallowed every hint of light. Then, with no warning, a pair of glowing red eyes blinked open in the void above them. Logan's breath caught in his throat as he realized they were not alone. Slowly the eyes descended, bringing with them a twisted figure of darkness that seemed to slither through the air. It was humanoid but wrong, its limbs elongated, its fingers ending in razor-sharp points. Its mouth split open in a jagged grin, revealing rows of needle-like teeth. "Welcome," it hissed, its voice a grotesque parody of the old man's. "You've awakened something far older than him." The creature lunged, its movements unnaturally fast. Logan and Mia dove out of the way, narrowly avoiding its grasp. The air where it passed felt icy, as though it sucked the warmth from the room. Logan scrambled to his feet, pulling Mia up. "Run," he shouted. They bolted across the room, slamming into the door. It wouldn't budge. The creature moved again, gliding across the floor like a shadow given form. Its arms stretched, clawed fingers reaching for them. Mia screamed, kicking at the door in desperation. "Think, Logan," she cried. "We need to do something." Logan's mind raced. His eyes fell on the still glowing runes etched into the floor. An idea reckless and desperate flashed through his mind. "The runes," he shouted. "Maybe they can stop it." Mia hesitated for a heartbeat, then nodded. Together, they turned back to face the creature. It paused, as if sensing their intent. Its grin widened, and the shadows around it thickened, swirling like a storm. Logan grabbed a piece of broken wood from the floor, his hand shaking. "Whatever happens, stay close," he said. The creature lunged again, its limbs twisting and writhing. Logan and Mia darted in opposite directions, trying to draw it away from the center of the room. Logan swung the wood, aiming for the runes, but the creature was faster. One of its elongated arms struck him, sending him crashing into the wall. Pain shot through his ribs, and he struggled to breathe. "Logan," Mia cried, her voice filled with terror. She stepped between him and the creature, her own fear momentarily forgotten. The thing hissed, its red eyes burning like embers. It lunged at her, its claws outstretched. In a desperate move, Mia raised her hands, and for a moment it seemed as though the air around her thickened. The creature faltered, its movements sluggish. The runes on the floor glowed brighter, responding to something inside her. Logan watched in awe and confusion, as Mia's eyes briefly mirrored the red glow. "Keep it there," Logan shouted, pushing himself to his feet. He limped back toward the runes, feeling their heat against his skin. He didn't know what he was doing, only that the symbols seemed to be the key. He traced the lines with his fingers, feeling the energy pulsing beneath them. The creature shrieked, its form flickering. Shadows peeled away from it, clawing at the air. Mia strained, sweat pouring down her face. "I can't hold it," she gasped. "Just a little longer," Logan shouted. He focused all his energy on the runes, willing them to react. His hands burned, but he didn't let go. The symbols glowed even brighter, and the room vibrated with an intensity that made his teeth ache. Then, with a final pulse of light, the runes flared, filling the room with blinding brilliance. The creature let out a bone-rattling scream as it was engulfed by the light. Its body twisted and writhed, its form splintering into wisps of shadow that was sucked into the glowing runes. The light dimmed, and the room fell silent. The air was still, heavy with the scent of burnt wood and something acrid. Logan collapsed to his knees, exhaustion washing over him. "Did we do it?" he panted, looking up at Mia. She nodded weakly, her legs barely holding her upright. But before relief could fully settle in, the house trembled. The walls groaned, and cracks splintered across the floor. "We need to leave," Mia said, her voice tight with urgency. Logan nodded, forcing himself to stand. They stumbled toward the door, which creaked open on its own, as if the house itself was giving them a final chance. They didn't look back. Behind them, the room continued to collapse, shadows pouring from the cracks like dark smoke. They raced through the twisting hallways, the house shifting and groaning around them. The old man's laughter echoed once more, distant but chilling. "You think you've won?" his voice taunted. "The game never ends." Finally, they burst through the front door and into the night. The cold air hit them like a slap, and they fell to the ground, gasping for breath. Behind them, the house shuddered, its windows flickering with red light before going dark. The oppressive weight lifted, and the night was silent once more. Logan and Mia lay there, their bodies trembling. "Is it over?" Mia asked, her voice small. Logan stared at the house, now dark and still. "I don't know," he said. The words hung between them, heavy with the knowledge that some doors, once opened, could never truly be closed. The quiet of the night felt suffocating. Logan and Mia lay on the cold ground, staring at the house that now loomed like a gaping wound in the fabric of reality. It was dark again, its windows blank and lifeless, but something inside them knew it wasn't truly over. The wind picked up, rustling the dry leaves around them, as if whispering secrets they weren't ready to hear. Logan pushed himself up, his body protesting with every movement. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice rough from exhaustion. "As far away as possible." Mia nodded weakly, her eyes never leaving the house. There was something about it, a lingering presence that made her feel like they were being watched. They forced themselves to their feet, leaning on each other for support. Their legs felt like lead, and every step away from the house felt like wading through mud. But they kept moving, driven by the primal need to escape. They made it halfway down the driveway when the ground trembled beneath them. Logan stopped, dread coiling in his stomach. He turned slowly, fearing what he might see. The house was shifting, its edges blurring, as if it were trying to pull itself back together. Shadows poured from its windows, swirling like ink in water. A low, throbbing sound filled the air, resonating deep in their bones. Mia grabbed Logan's arm. "No," she whispered. "We're not going back. We're not." The shadows stretched across the ground, reaching for them like black tendrils. Logan yanked Mia forward, their pace quickening despite their exhaustion. They stumbled over roots and rocks, the shadows always just behind. The air grew colder, and the sound of whispering voices surrounded them. Logan felt a hand brush against his ankle, cold and skeletal, and he nearly fell. He kicked frantically, freeing himself, and they broke into a desperate sprint. The end of the driveway was just ahead. If they could make it to the street, maybe the grip of the house would weaken. But as they reached the edge, the shadows surged forward, blocking their path. They twisted and writhed, forming a barrier that pulsed with malevolent energy. "Get back," Mia shouted, raising her arms instinctively. She didn't know what she was doing, but the memory of the rune's power was fresh in her mind. A faint red glow flickered around her hands, and the shadows recoiled, hissing like steam. For a moment, the barrier weakened. "Now," Logan yelled, grabbing her hand. Together, they leapt through the gap, landing hard on the asphalt. The shadows surged again, but stopped abruptly at the edge of the driveway, as if an invisible boundary held them back. The house's power couldn't reach them here, or so they hoped. They didn't wait to find out. Logan and Mia stumbled down the street, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The houses around them were dark, lifeless. The silence was heavy, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant creak of the house settling behind them. It felt like a temporary reprieve, a fragile moment that could shatter at any second. Finally, they reached a street lamp that flickered weakly but offered some semblance of light. They collapsed beneath it, their bodies spent. Logan's hands were shaking, and he could still feel the icy touch of the shadows on his skin. "What was that?" he whispered. "What did we just go through?" Mia shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't know. Logan, I want to go home." They sat there, huddled together, trying to catch their breath, but the night offered no comfort. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the faintest echo of the old man's laughter. Logan's eyes darted back to the house. It was dark, but he could still feel its presence, like a weight pressing down on his chest. He knew they had escaped, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly won. "Look," Mia whispered, pointing down the street. Logan followed her gaze. A figure was standing at the end of the block, just beyond the reach of the street lamp's light. It was tall and thin, with pale skin that almost glowed in the darkness. The old man. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched. Logan's breath caught in his throat. It can't be. The old man raised one skeletal hand in a slow, mocking wave. Then he stepped back, melting into the shadows. The wind died down, and the air grew still. For a long moment, neither Logan nor Mia spoke. They were paralyzed, trapped between disbelief and the crushing weight of reality. Finally, Mia broke the silence. "What do we do now?" Logan didn't have an answer. He wanted to believe it was over, that they could go home and forget this nightmare. But deep down, he knew the truth. The house and whatever dark power it held wasn't done with them. It had let them go, for now, but it would be watching, waiting. "We get away," he said, though the words felt hollow. "As far as we can." They stood up, leaning on each other for strength, and began walking. The night pressed in around them, heavy with unspoken promises and unseen horrors. Each step felt like a battle, but they kept moving, driven by the desperate hope that somewhere, somehow, they might find safety. But even as they walked, Logan couldn't shake the feeling that the house had marked them, that it had only been a taste of what was to come. The game, the old man had said, never truly ended. In the distance, the wind picked up again, carrying with it a faint, mocking laugh. The wind's chilling laughter faded into the distance, but its echo lingered in Logan and Mia's minds as they trudged forward, the weight of what they'd seen pressing down like lead. The street remained eerily empty, every house dark and silent, as if the entire neighborhood had been abandoned. Their footsteps were the only sounds, muffled against the cracked pavement, and each creak of wind through branches made them flinch. Logan kept glancing over his shoulder, half expecting to see the old man's pale figure lurking in the shadows. "How far do you think we need to go?" he asked, his voice low and trembling. "Until we don't feel it anymore," Mia replied, but even she knew how impossible that was. The sensation of being watched clung to them like a second skin. The memory of the house's oppressive presence seared into their bones. No distance felt like it would ever be enough. Ahead, the faint glow of a convenience store's neon sign appeared around a bend. The flickering letters barely pierced the darkness, but it was the first sign of life they'd seen since escaping. "Come on," Logan urged, quickening his pace. "We need to get somewhere with people." The door to the store jingled as they pushed inside, the harsh fluorescent lights stinging their eyes. A bored-looking cashier stood behind the counter, barely acknowledging their entrance. The store was empty except for the faint hum of a refrigerator and the distant buzz of a fly circling a sticky spill. Logan and Mia moved through the narrow aisles, their hands still trembling. It felt surreal. Shelves of candy bars, chips and bottled drinks surrounded them, so ordinary yet painfully distant from the nightmare they'd just lived through. They reached the back of the store and leaned against a cold glass door, catching their breath. "What do we tell people?" Mia asked. Her voice was low, brittle. "That we went into a haunted house and some thing tried to kill us? No one will believe us." Logan nodded, swallowing hard. "We don't have to tell anyone. We just need to get away." But even as he said it, a cold realization crept in. What if it followed them? What if it was always going to follow them? Their hushed conversation was interrupted by a loud creak, like the groan of an old door opening. Logan froze, his pulse hammering in his ears. He glanced at Mia, who shook her head, silently pleading for it not to be what they feared. But then they heard it, a faint, familiar laugh, distant but unmistakable. The store's lights flickered. The cashier looked up from their phone, a hint of annoyance on their face, but didn't seem to notice anything else. Shadows stretched unnaturally along the floor, creeping up the walls. Logan's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't over. It had followed them. The shadows coiled together near the front of the store, forming a shape that sent icy dread through both of them. It wasn't the old man this time. The figure was shorter, hunched, with clawed hands that dragged against the linoleum. Its face was hidden beneath a tangle of matted hair, but they could see the glint of sharp teeth as it smiled. "Not again," Mia whispered, backing away until she hit the cold glass behind her. The creature cocked its head, as if savoring their fear. It moved slowly, deliberately, dragging its twisted limbs forward. The shadows around it pulsed, shifting with each step. Logan grabbed a metal shelf, yanking it toward them. "Stay behind me," he shouted, his voice cracking. The creature lunged, faster than either of them expected. The shelf clattered to the ground, scattering cans and boxes everywhere. Logan swung a metal pole at the thing, but it passed through the creature like it was striking smoke. The claws raked through the air, narrowly missing him. The lights flickered again, plunging the store into moments of darkness. When the light returned, the creature was gone, only to reappear inches from Mia. She screamed, stumbling back and crashing into a display of glass bottles. They shattered around her, the smell of soda and syrup mixing with fear. "Leave us alone," Logan shouted, desperation lacing his words. He swung wildly, his movements fueled by adrenaline and terror. The creature's smile widened, showing too many teeth. It was playing with them. Mia struggled to her feet, shards of glass cutting into her hands. She didn't notice the blood. "Logan, we can't fight it like this," she said, her voice shaking. "It's like the house. It's part of it," Logan finished, the realization hitting him like a punch. They couldn't fight it in the way they were used to. It was more shadow than substance, a manifestation of the darkness that had claimed the house. But there had to be a way to weaken it, something that would force it back. The creature lunged again, its claws slicing through the air. Logan grabbed Mia's hand, yanking her toward the back exit. They crashed through the door, stumbling into the cold night air. Behind them, the creature's distorted laugh echoed, mocking their fear. They didn't stop running. They tore through alleyways and back streets, their legs burning, lungs aching. Finally, they collapsed against the side of an old brick building. Logan's vision swam and he fought to catch his breath. "We need to end this," he gasped, "before it gets worse." Mia nodded, wiping sweat and blood from her face. "But how? We barely got out alive last time." Logan thought of the runes, the energy that had surged through the house. Whatever power it was, it seemed tied to the darkness they were facing. "We need to find out more," he said, his voice steadier now. "About the house, the symbols, everything." "Are you serious?" Mia asked, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You want to go back?" "No," Logan said quickly. "But we need to understand it. Otherwise it'll keep coming. It won't stop." The wind picked up again, carrying that familiar, chilling laugh. It was closer this time, as if mocking their resolve. Logan and Mia exchanged a look, one of fear, but also determination. They didn't have a choice. Whatever curse they had awakened, they would have to find a way to break it, before it consumed them completely. The shadows moved in the distance, a silent reminder that their nightmare was far from over. And as they stood there, huddled in the cold night, they knew the game had only just begun. The air around them felt colder, as if the darkness itself was closing in. The faint laughter that had haunted them since they escaped the house still echoed, carried on the wind like a taunt. Logan and Mia stood pressed against the brick wall, their breaths mingling in the cold night air, their exhaustion giving way to a grim determination. They didn't want to face the shadows again, but it was clear now running would never be enough. "What do we do?" Mia asked, her voice low and desperate. "We don't know anything about that place or why it's after us." "We need answers," Logan replied, his jaw tight. "There has to be someone who knows what's going on. The house can't be the first time this has happened." Mia nodded reluctantly. "But where do we even start? We can't just Google creepy shadow house that tries to kill you." Logan managed a weak smile despite the fear gnawing at him. "I'm sure people have tried worse. They knew they couldn't stay in the open any longer. Every shadow felt like a potential threat. Every flicker of light a sign that the old man or whatever dark force was manipulating him was watching. Together, they made their way back to the main street, keeping to well-lit areas and avoiding the darkest corners. The neon sign of the convenience store faded into the distance, replaced by the harsh glare of streetlights that offered no real comfort. After what felt like hours of walking, they stumbled upon a small library, its windows dimly lit from within. It was one of those places that seemed to belong to another time, its old stone facade worn by decades of wind and rain. A light flickered inside, and the sign on the door read "Open." The sight of it felt like a lifeline. "Here," Logan said, pulling Mia toward the entrance. "Maybe there's something in here." "A library?" Mia asked skeptically. "You think they have a how-to manual for surviving haunted houses?" Logan shrugged. "It's worth a shot." Inside, the air was warm and smelled of old books and dust. Rows of shelves stretched into the dimly lit space, and the creak of the floorboards beneath their feet made them jump. An elderly man with round glasses sat behind the front desk, his head bowed over a book. He didn't look up as they entered, but there was something about him, a stillness that felt different from the oppressive quiet of the house. "Excuse me," Logan said, his voice barely above a whisper. The man raised his head slowly, and for a moment, Logan was terrified that he'd see those pale eyes again. But the librarian's gaze was sharp and clear, his expression one of mild curiosity. "Yes," the man asked, his voice deep but kind. "Can I help you?" Logan glanced at Mia, who nodded. He took a deep breath. We need information. About a house. An old one. Victorian. Lots of dark stuff happening there." The librarian's eyes narrowed slightly. "You'll have to be more specific," he said, but there was a flicker of something recognition that crossed his face. "It's cursed," Mia blurted out. "Or haunted. I don't know. There was an old man and shadows, and it won't leave us alone." For a moment, the librarian said nothing. He closed the book in front of him with deliberate care, then gestured for them to follow him. "Come with me." They exchanged a wary glance but followed him deeper into the library. He led them past rows of dusty bookshelves and into a small, secluded room at the back. Shelves lined the walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked centuries old. The air here was colder, and the faint scent of candle wax lingered. The librarian gestured for them to sit at an old wooden table. "You're not the first," he said, his tone grave, "and I doubt you'll be the last." "What do you mean?" Logan asked, his throat tightening. The librarian leaned back, his gaze never leaving theirs. "That house has stood for more than a century. Many have gone in, thinking it was just another relic of the past. Most never came out. Those who did, well, let's just say they were marked." "Marked?" Mia whispered, a chill running down her spine. He nodded. "It's not just a house. It's a doorway. A place where things bleed through dark things. It feeds on fear, on pain. Once you've been touched by it, it doesn't let go easily." Logan clenched his fists. "How do we stop it?" The librarian's expression darkened. "Stopping it? That's a dangerous path. The house is ancient, older than you or I can fathom. Its power is tied to the rituals that bind it, rituals that can be disrupted, but only with great risk." "What kind of risk?" Mia asked, her voice trembling. The librarian pulled a thick, leather-bound book from one of the shelves and placed it on the table. Its cover was marked with strange symbols, similar to the ones they had seen carved into the floor of the house. He flipped through the pages until he found an illustration, a depiction of the runes glowing, surrounded by shadowy figures. "There are ways," he said slowly, "but the house will fight back. It always does. You'd need to weaken its grip from within, disrupt its connection to the other side." Logan's mouth went dry. "You mean, we'd have to go back?" The librarian met his gaze, unflinching. "If you want to end this, yes, but know that it will be waiting for you, and it will be stronger, more desperate. It won't let you go so easily this time." Mia's hands trembled. "We barely made it out alive." "You did," the librarian said, his voice softening, "which means you have a chance. The house's power is not limitless. It can be weakened. but you must be prepared. Logan's mind raced. He wanted to run, to disappear and pretend none of this had happened. But the memory of the shadows, the old man's laughter, and the creature's twisted smile haunted him. If they didn't end it, it would come for them again. And again. "We'll do it," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Tell us what we need to do." The librarian nodded slowly and began to explain. Hours passed as they pored over ancient texts, learning about the rituals that could sever the house's connection to whatever dark force controlled it. Symbols, incantations, and ways to manipulate the runes. It was dangerous and far from guaranteed, but it was a chance. As they prepared to leave, the librarian placed a hand on Logan's shoulder. "Be careful. The house will know you're coming." They nodded and stepped back into the night. The wind howled around them, and for a moment, Logan swore he saw a shadow move in the distance. He took Mia's hand, their grip tight and unyielding. Whatever waited for them back at that house, they would face it together. The game was far from over, but they were ready to fight. The night felt colder than before, the wind carrying whispers that clawed at their ears as Logan and Mia left the library. Every step they took toward the house made the weight in their chests heavier, and each shadow along the street seemed to twitch with malicious intent. They were heading back into the nightmare, and they both knew there was no guarantee they'd make it out again. But the alternative was worse, an eternity spent running, hunted by darkness that would never relent. They walked in silence, the instructions from the librarian echoing in their minds. Symbols and rituals, ways to weaken the house's power from within. The knowledge felt like a thin shield against an oncoming storm, but it was all they had. Logan kept glancing at Mia, searching for reassurance, but her face was pale, her jaw set in grim determination. He wished he could promise her everything would be okay, but the lie stuck in his throat. They stopped at the edge of the driveway. The house loomed before them, its silhouette darker than the night around it. The air was thick, and the oppressive feeling of being watched returned with full force. The windows were black, empty, but Logan could feel the house's malevolent gaze upon them. "Ready?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. Mia nodded, though her hands shook. "Let's end this." They stepped onto the driveway, each step feeling like they were being swallowed whole. The ground beneath them seemed to shift, and the air grew colder with every breath. As they approached the porch, the door creaked open on its own, a dark invitation. This time they didn't hesitate. If they did, they might lose what little courage they had left. The interior was as they remembered, dimly lit by flickering candles, the air heavy with the scent of rot and something metallic. Shadows slithered along the walls, moving just beyond the edge of their vision. The oppressive silence pressed down on them, broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards under their feet. Logan and Mia moved quickly, guided by the librarian's instructions. The first step was to mark the entrance with a protective symbol to keep the shadows at bay. Logan knelt, drawing the intricate pattern on the floor with trembling fingers. As he completed the final line, the symbol glowed faintly, a warm light pushing back the encroaching darkness. For a moment, it felt like they had a chance. But the house was aware. A deep, resonant laugh filled the air, shaking the walls. It was the old man's voice, but distorted, layered with something deeper and far more ancient. "Back so soon," it mocked. "Did you miss my hospitality?" The shadows around them convulsed, and the air grew thick with malice. Logan and Mia stood back to back, their eyes scanning the shifting darkness. "Remember what the librarian said," Logan whispered. "The symbols weaken it." "But it's not going to make this easy," Mia replied, her voice tight. The house reacted violently. Shadows surged toward them, forming twisted shapes, clawed hands, contorted faces, things that should not have existed. One lunged at Logan, and he barely dodged, feeling the cold touch of shadow scrape his arm. Pain flared, and he bit back a scream. "We have to move," Mia shouted, grabbing his hand. They ran deeper into the house, the shadows close behind. The hallway twisted and warped around them, stretching impossibly long one moment, and then shrinking the next. Doors appeared and disappeared, and the walls seemed to breathe. Finally, they stumbled into a large room, the parlor, where it had all begun. The silver tray with the cursed candies still sat on the table, untouched and gleaming in the flickering candlelight. The runes on the floor, once dull and cracked, now glowed with a sinister red light. "It's the source," Mia said, her voice trembling with both fear and determination. "This is where we have to break it." Logan nodded. "The symbols. We need to carve new ones." They moved quickly, scratching new symbols into the wooden floor with whatever they could find: broken glass, shards of metal. As each symbol was completed, the light from the runes dimmed and the oppressive weight in the room lessened. But the house fought back. The shadows grew more frenzied, clawing at them with desperate fury. The old man appeared at the edge of the room, his form flickering like a broken image. His eyes glowed with cold fire, and his smile was a grotesque parody of life. "You think you can sever what has been bound for centuries?" he hissed. "You are nothing but children." Logan stood, his chest heaving. "Maybe. But we're not afraid of you anymore." The old man's smile faltered, and for the first time, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. The shadows around him surged, forming a barrier. He raised his hands, and the air crackled with dark energy. "Then you will die here," he snarled. The room erupted into chaos. The shadows twisted and writhed, striking at Logan and Mia with relentless fury. They dodged and fought, every movement fueled by desperation. Logan felt the cold touch of the darkness again and again, sapping his strength. He stumbled, his vision blurring. Mia screamed his name, her voice raw. Summoning every last bit of strength, Logan reached for the final symbol. He traced it with shaking hands, feeling the energy surge beneath his fingertips. The light flared, bright and blinding, and the shadows recoiled with ear-piercing shrieks. The old man's form flickered, his face contorting with rage and fear. "No," he roared, his voice shattering the air. The ground trembled, and cracks splintered across the floor. The red light from the runes pulsed wildly, then exploded outward, engulfing the room in searing brightness. The old man's scream echoed, fading into nothingness as the shadows were torn apart. Then there was silence. Logan opened his eyes, blinking against the dim light. The runes were gone, their power broken. The air felt lighter, and the oppressive presence that had haunted the house was gone. Mia knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face. "We did it," she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. They stumbled out of the room, their bodies aching and battered. The house was silent now, lifeless. As they stepped through the front door, the sun was beginning to rise, bathing the world in a soft, golden light. They collapsed on the porch, their exhaustion catching up to them. "It's over," Logan said, barely able to keep his eyes open. Mia nodded, leaning against him. "Let's hope it stays that way." The wind rustled the leaves, and for the first time in what felt like forever, it carried no whispers, no laughter, just the quiet promise of a new day. But deep in the recesses of their minds, they knew the scars would remain. The house had marked them, and while they had broken its grip, they would never truly forget. As they sat there, watching the sun rise, they vowed never to speak of it again. The house was just an empty shell now, but they would carry its darkness with them, always a reminder of the night they faced the shadows and won. But at what cost, they would never truly know.